So there's this big problem with writing music for video games, like a critical, fundamental problem with all video games when it comes to the music. And that problem is, I cannot make you press the start button. I'm not kidding around here. If you're a composer, this is a pretty serious issue. See, time is the canvas on which we paint music. Music has this inherent temporal aspect to it. So without complete control over all the temporal aspects of the game, we cannot completely control the music and appropriately synchronize music to what's going on the screen. So if I wanted to have a specific build-up to a specific moment with one giant climax like we see in film all the time, I'm kinda SOL because it is literally impossible to do that in a video game. So when it comes to the start menu, unless I start the game in absolute silence and then just have one big moment as soon as you press the start button, like... fine, that might work for the main menu, but I can't sync up that one chord to resolve when you crit the boss. I can't have the music swell and build up to that one moment where you finally make that hard jump and finish the level. I can't smoothly transition from the press start screen to the main menu theme the way I want because I can't time when you're gonna press the start button. Hell, you might never press the start button. Then what do I do? See, unlike film or television, video game scores operate in the world of indeterminate music. Now, indeterminate music and indeterminacy means that there is some aspect of the piece of music that's left up to chance. And there's this big debate going on about all these terms that I'm about to use, so I'm just going to give you my 2 cents and we'll let the comment section work this one out. There are 2 different types of indeterminate music: chance music and aleatoric music. Chance music is the indeterminacy of composition. What that means is that during some point of the composition process, chance was involved. So a good example of chance music is John Cage's Music of Changes. Music of Changes was written using Yi Ching, which, if I remember correctly, is this old Chinese book that has a lot of divination tools, seeing into the future and that kind of thing. So in essence, John Cage had his fortune read by this book, and then applied a musical system to the results of his fortune, wrote it down, and that became the piece of music. If only turning in all your homework assignments could be that easy. So the process of composition was governed by chance, but every performance of Music of Changes is fundamentally the same because they all use the same score. Once he wrote down the results of his fortune and committed it to just one score, that was the end of the indeterminacy in that specific piece of music. But if instead of handing out the same score to everybody, he decided to give everyone a copy of Yi Ching and instructions on how you can translate your own fortune into musical notation, then he would have created something aleatoric. Aleatoric music is the indeterminacy of performance. Although the composer will write a score, they'll leave some aspect of the performance up to the performers. A great example of this is an old dice game called Musikalisches Würfelspiel, which is German for musical dice game. And the idea is that you would roll the dice, and depending on what you'd roll, you play a small piece of music. So say you roll a 3. You have to play the piece of music marked number 3. So in the end, after a few dice rolls, you'd have a complete piece of music, which also meant that every performance of this composition would pretty much be different. Which is interesting because aleatoric or aleatory comes from alea, which is Latin for dice. Supposedly Mozart had a version of this game composed with his works, but I haven't been able to find any examples of it. I also heard a story about him writing a piece of music on the back of playing cards so that every time he shuffled the deck, the piece would rearrange, which again would be aleatoric, but I haven't been able to find any evidence that existed either. A really classic example of aleatoric music that you'll hear about is Terry Riley's In C. Now, this is the score to In C. It's made up of 53 small segments, and you're instructed to play them mostly in order, but you can repeat any section as many times as you like, and I think you're even allowed to skip one if you feel like it, which doesn't seem all that impressive at first until you realize that this piece is designed for an indefinite number of performers. So if you're in a group of however many performers, every single one of you can be at a different point in the piece, which is by design, and that ends up giving us something that sounds like this. It's a real knee slapper, I know, but that means that every performance of this piece, regardless of how many people are playing, sounds completely different. Indeterminacy in music is a really fascinating topic. Like, when you think about it, jazz and metal are kind of fundamentally aleatoric in their design because they both feature soloists that play made-up music on the spot that follows a chordal guide originally intended by the composer. Technically speaking, no 2 solos will ever be the same, but I guess that's not always the case. And if you want to go even further with this, you can look into the composers who started feeling limited by musical notation and starting using other graphical techniques in order to convey an aleatoric direction that they wanted their score to take. Hey, I'm not going to tell you what note to play, tell me what you think this box looks like. Which, like, I get it. When Ligeti and Penderecki do it, it's genius, but when I do it, it's considered lazy and amateurish and doesn't meet the grading criteria. But what's important to take away from this is that pressing that start button is a fundamentally aleatoric action. The composer cannot control when you'll press start, the same way the composer can't control when and how you're going to experience all the little pieces of music that they put in their game. What that means is that with every video game ever made, the composer is the composer, but the player is both the audience and the performer, because no two video game playthroughs are exactly the same, meaning that every experience of a video game score is different and unique. You finished the first level of Mario at a different speed than I did, and that fundamentally altered the duration and all subsequent temporal aspects of the composition. And that doesn't even begin to take into consideration all of the sound design elements and how they tie into the complete experience of a video game soundtrack. The best video game composers understand that there is a fundamentally indeterminate nature to video game soundtracks, and they purposefully structure their music to better work within that context. Techniques like horizontal resequencing, where depending on what the player does, a certain piece of music will be swapped out with another, like when you hear a different piece of music when you enter a new level, or like when the music switches to the battle music when you hit a random encounter, or maybe composers will add or drop instruments from the mix depending on what the player's doing, which is commonly known as vertical reorchestration, like how they always add a percussion track whenever Mario hops onto a Yoshi. Even something as simple as altering the tempo can have a significant effect on both the score and the overall experience of the game. But without fail, the absolute best video game soundtracks and video game composers will mix these techniques, along with all other kinds of tips and tricks, to create a fleshed out world of music that the player can explore. This is the unique advantage that video games have over all other forms of synchronized music. It's not just enough to have one looping track anymore, and you're never going to be able to accurately predict when a player is going to do something in your game. If you want that kind of control over your score, then you have to go to the world of film and television. One of my favorite experiences when playing a video game is exploring how a composer prepared their score for indeterminacy. Like, as much as I like listening to a game soundtrack from the album, it just isn't the same as listening to the music in the context of the game. In many instances, composers are forced to arrange their music in an unnatural way in order to have it make sense on the album. In some cases, they have to leave entire pieces of music out of the printed soundtrack altogether. The only way you can completely experience a game soundtrack is by actually sitting down and playing the game. Or, I guess another way to put it is that you have to sit down and perform the game's composition. Hopefully, as technology develops and composers become more and more familiar with the world of video games, we'll finally be able to see the next step of musical innovation. Maybe one day a video game composer could win a Pulitzer for their contributions to the world of indeterminate music instead of competing with films for a Grammy. So when it comes to the world of video game music, it might be frustrating to not really be able to hear a complete video game soundtrack without actually playing the game, and the reputation of endlessly looping music might make it difficult for some people to take it seriously. But the truth is, when you think about it, you aren't really going to hear anything like this anywhere else. Thank you for watching. I'd like to thank my patrons for making these videos possible, with a very special thank you to AFN Matt and Anna Birch. If you like what you saw here, be sure to subscribe and check out my other videos. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch to have your musical questions answered live. And if you really like what I'm doing, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. But that's going to be it from me for now. Thanks for watching.